I'm really liking my earlier recording associated with how operators are used in the Noble Ape simulation and the explanation, in particular, of the biological simulation based on quantum mechanics. So I thought I'd go back to the code and actually go through this again. So the underlying landform gives us, what, six different operators? Yes. So the operators, so you have an underlying landform, and from this you can calculate at any given point the area of that point, which is just uh, like a differential basically. So it's like if you projected a little square down on that point and you photographed it, how would be the best way to describe it? You project a square down on that point and then you flatten out the map. What would the area of that projected square be? So, for example, if there was a slight tilt in the land, it would move greater than the square size. So at points of really steep slopes, for example, the area would be very large, whereas when it was flat, it would be at its least point, basically. The height of the land, whether or not there's water at the land, the moving sunlight, which is sunlight at a particular time, the total sunlight, which is sunlight calculated over time, and also the salt content. From these six different operators, you can then say, what is the probability that there will be a bush? Well, here, height isn't particularly good, but water is good. What is O? Actually, U, which is total sunlight and lack of salt. So what you want here is not so much height, but a good amount of water, plenty of sunlight, and not a lot of salt, and that will guarantee you a bush. Grass, however, grass will grow everywhere, so it doesn't have a height requirement, but it's basically the same. A tree is more interesting. Ideally, a tree does not like surface area. A tree wants as flat a ground as possible. However, it does like height, it does like water, it does like total sunlight, and it doesn't like salt. And then you go through these logics, and then with the animals, the actual critters that live in the environment, then moving sunlight obviously is going to have a greater effect. So all of these have moving sunlight related effects on them, which none of the plants have. It's curious why rock pools and beaches here. Beach has some degree of, I guess the moving sunlight on the beach indicates potentially the tide flow, I would say, but I'm not really sure why that value is there. Anyway, let's look at how operators are used. So, let's specifically look for this. So operators are used in two separate locations. This is associated with ApeScript, so this is getting ApeScript out, and it runs through here. You can tell ApeScript's interaction here because it comes through the sketch output, which is an ApeScript exit function. Now, most specifically, actually, it probably should be used like this because it's a function that's passed in to the interpret. So, as it is called, however, so we interpret, cycle, interpret. It's where interpret is set up that's important here. Here we go. So, Here, sketch output and sketch input are used as the inputs and outputs surrounding the ape script. So that's how one of the locations that the operator is called. Let's just go back to where it is specifically here. Yeah. Let's look for another use. And here it's used in the food to find the location of a particular kind of food. I'm going to actually expand this to allow for the collection of eggs and potentially the eating of insects, both of which do have some interest in primate diet. But here, what it's trying to find is an interpolated value of the surrounding location. Which is interesting. So in the last video I actually had some issue associated with how this was being used. I want to get a better understanding of it. So let's have a look at it specifically. So this gets a land operator back, but for some reason it uses ape space to map space, an interpolated value. So this isn't a... Yeah, this is just really badly used. The problem by using ape space to map space is it indicates that you're actually taking a spatial characteristic. It's not just that you're taking, 1/64th of it. Which I think is just really bad framing, because people will read that and think, that you're taking 1/64th of that. So, interpolated here is a 64-bit value, or it's a 32-bit initially. So, why not take this and do it by 7, and then just sum these. The other option would be to actually do a proper bilinear interpolation of it. And actually take these points and calculate over the ape space location. There really needs to be bilinear interpolation. Bilinear interpolation is used so much through the simulation that there should really be just a simple math bilinear interpolation that does that. Because this method is not ideal. Like, you'd really want to interpolate between those points properly, as opposed to just taking an average between the locations. I mean, what this is doing is taking some kind of surrounding. So, map Y, map X. So this is taking above and below, but it's not actually taking the actual value. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is taking the... Yeah, it's very strange. So maybe it is a legitimate use of ape space to map space, because you're actually using it as a multiplier, quite curiously here. Okay, let's move that back. But yeah, this needs to be reworded accordingly. It's very funnily done as well because it should be taking a point. So one of these points should actually be map x, map y, rather than this curious division. Anyway, we'll leave it like that for the time being. So what this does is it actually interpolates between the it's a linear interpolation, not a bilinear interpolation. Hum. Anyway, so what it's doing here, because the map space is actually considerably coarser than the ape space. So the apes move around in 64 units within each of the individual map points. There was some discussion associated with how big the simulation is, and we'll get into that in another video. But what's interesting here is that the map space is no longer, there's like a midpoint as well. So you've got the map space, which in this case is 512 by 512, and then you have there's an interpolated space, which is 4096 by 4096, which is probably better actually for calculating the simulation. I don't think 4096 is 512 times 64. Pretty sure that isn't the case. Anyway. And then you have the ape space resolution, which is even finer. Let's do some calculation. When in doubt. So this is the ape space. Sorry, this is the map space. And then you have the bilinear interpolated space. Yeah. And then you have the ape space, which would be 512 times 64. So this is the ape space they're moving in. This is the range over the map. And then, like I said, there's a midpoint, which is 4096, which is used for the drawing, which I'll get to shortly. And then you have the map space, which is 512. And these are the three interacting spaces that has calculations accordingly. So, for example, this is this part here, which is 8 times difference, right? So divided by 8, 4096, okay. So there are 3 spaces. You have the ape space, the map space, and then the high resolution map space. Ideally these would become more unified. It would be really quite nice actually to have the high resolution map space to be the same as the ape space. But memory constraint wise, so sorry folks. So 16 meg isn't that big, but in order for it to be the full space, so yes, it would be a gig to have the map space at the same resolution the ape space. It could be doable. Not really a huge issue, but it's still slightly better to have this kind of midpoint high resolution map space. So if we use that space instead for calculating the biology, you would end up with a slightly, let's move back here. Is there a corresponding ape space to high resolution map space? So we would use that instead. Probably not do all this interpolation. And land operator is only, what? Land operator is only used within land. So yes, you would rewrite land operator, and instead of using this, you would use the high resolution map space, and you would do exactly the same calculation. The deltas, slightly more interesting. You probably need to do some normalization out of some of these deltas. So some of the constants that are added, basically these kind of things you need to fix. But you could then get it down to a finer resolution. It begs the question what the map space would then be used for. The map space would only be used for drawing in that circumstance, and only drawing the map. So you run the simulation. I'll get into this in another video, but I just want to explain this simply. This is the map space. This is how the map space is presented. This is 512 by 512. This drawing, I'll pause it, is being done on the high resolution map space. Each of these points that are being drawn, well actually it could potentially be tiled, all the points, you don't really know that, but each of the points on here are from the high resolution map space. So this is the level of detail of the high resolution map space. What I'm proposing is to rewrite the biological simulation based on the high resolution map space, not based on this map space, and thus eliminate the kind of curious bilinear interpolation. Now it's not going to be exact, but you're going to be 64 by 64 better in the high resolution map space. Is it 64 or is it 8? Well, it's going to be 64 by it's multiply it by 8 twice. But yeah, you get a better resolution for this, and it's probably going to be a lot more superior than the method currently being used. Probably simplify the mathematics down a little bit as well. And we could go in here and then simplify a lot of this stuff as well. So for example, if you're using the small step, I don't think you need to use the multiplication by 8, but I need to run through and check these values again. All these values are used in relative terms as well, which is what's particularly curious. So if you look at the land operator interpolate, so these are where it's being used. It's always being used in a relative sense. So here with food location, what you're getting here are values, but the way that the values are actually used, is values used in any other way? There seems to be something, actually, yeah, associated with picking stuff up. Okay. So yes, what you'd want here is, yeah, the way it's used is always relative. So it's not interested in a specific number. It's just interested if something is greater than in these contexts, which means that scaling is probably less important. Obviously, if you were using it for something more specific, you'd have to go back and look at the scaling and say, hold it, wait, this grass value needs to be exactly the same whether you use the regular map or the high resolution map. But because you're just using it as a comparison, it really doesn't matter whether the values are connected to a specific value or whether they can change over time. It's interesting, these offsets. Offset applies to land operator values. I don't know if this is a historical legacy or not. I think this just relates to... So this is actually where it gets interesting, because these offset values are constants that are being applied against these. So we'd need to know what these... We'd need to recalculate these values actually, so it's not quite as easy as originally proposed. Anyway, something to think about and some insight associated with biological simulation. I will record more of these videos, and no doubt there will be more elaborate wanderings through the same. Tom Barbalet, signing out.